The bustling streets of Manhattan faded as Barron Trump's limousine entered a forgotten neighborhood. His eyes widened at the sight of crumbling buildings and weary faces. Among them stood Mrs. Simmons, a frail 68-year-old widow clutching an eviction notice. What drove the youngest Trump to venture so far from his gilded world? "I never thought I'd see the day when a Trump would be my guardian angel," Mrs. Simmons would later say. How did this unlikely connection reshape both their lives? In the next few minutes, we'll explore a story that challenges our assumptions about privilege and compassion. Are you ready to see beyond the headlines and discover how an unexpected alliance bridged America's deepest divides? The sun glinted off the polished marble floors of Trump Tower as Barron Trump stood at the windows of his penthouse suite, gazing at the city below. His world was one of unimaginable luxury, a gilded cage that sheltered him from harsh realities beyond its golden bars. Despite his wealth, a growing emptiness gnawed at Barron's core. He felt like a rare bird, beautiful, but trapped behind invisible bars of privilege. His days were a carefully orchestrated symphony: gourmet breakfasts, private tutors, and exclusive outings. Yet beyond his chauffeured car's tinted windows, a different America existed. One afternoon, stuck in D.C. traffic, Barron noticed protesters outside a dilapidated building. Their signs spoke of evictions and rising rents. "What's happening there?" he asked his security guard. "It's a housing protest, sir. Some folks are being forced out due to gentrification," the guard explained hesitantly. Barron's brow furrowed. "Gentrification, what does that mean?" As the guard elaborated, Barron felt a strange mix of emotions. The contrast between his life and the struggles he glimpsed suddenly seemed overwhelming. His home's opulence felt almost obscene in the face of such hardship. That evening, unable to shake the images, Barron found himself in his father's study. A headline caught his eye: "Housing crisis deepens in D.C. Widow faces eviction after 40 years." He read about Eleanor Simmons, a 68-year-old widow on the verge of losing her family home. As he absorbed the details, Barron's world shifted. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His sheltered existence had left him blind to the realities faced by many Americans. Mrs. Simmons's struggles seemed to be happening on another planet. Barron's mind raced with questions. How many others were in her situation? What led to such inequality? What could be done about it? For the first time, Barron felt a spark of purpose ignite within him, a desire to understand, and perhaps even change the world beyond his gilded cage. The crisp autumn air nipped at Barron's cheeks as he stepped out of Trump Tower, his security detail grudgingly allowing him a rare, solo walk through the city. The bustling streets of Washington, D.C. pulsed with life around him, a stark contrast to the insulated world he typically inhabited. As he turned a corner, the young heir's ears pricked at the sound of a tearful voice. 40 years in this house. And now I have nowhere to go," the voice quavered, heavy with despair. Barron's steps slowed, curiosity drawing him closer. He peered around the edge of a building, careful to remain unseen. There, on the steps of a modest brownstone, stood an elderly woman. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands trembled as she clutched a piece of paper. The official letterhead and bold red stamp screamed, "Eviction Notice." The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, spoke into an old flip phone, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. The bank won't budge, and I've already sold everything of value. Your father's medical bills. They just keep coming." As Mrs. Simmons detailed her struggles, Barron found himself rooted to the spot. The weight of her words pressed down on him, each sentence revealing a world he'd only glimpsed through newspaper headlines. His mind flashed to the opulent breakfast spread, waiting for him back at Trump Tower: fresh pastries, exotic fruits, and a personal chef ready to whip up anything he desired. "I've tried everything," Mrs. Simmons continued. "I've cut back on meals, taken on odd jobs at my age, but it's not enough. The property taxes keep rising, and that predatory loan your father took out. I should have known better. But we were desperate." Barron's heart raced, torn between the urge to help and the knowledge that this moment wasn't about him. He thought of his own father, larger than life and seemingly invincible. What would happen to his mother if something were to happen to him? The thought sent a chill down his spine. "The community's changing so fast," Mrs. Simmons sighed. "All these new developments pushing out folks who've been here for generations. I remember when your father and I first moved in. We were so proud, Sarah. Our very own piece of the American dream." As Mrs. Simmons spoke of her late husband, Barron felt a lump form in his throat. He recalled a recent charity gala, where he'd stood uncomfortably in a tailored suit, surrounded by people discussing urban renewal, as if it were a game of Monopoly. "I keep thinking about all the memories in this house," Mrs. Simmons said softly. "Your first steps in the living room, the height marks on the kitchen door frame, the sound of your father's laugh echoing through these old walls. How do you pack up a lifetime, Sarah?" As Mrs. Simmons wiped away a tear, Barron felt something shift inside him. The world he thought he understood suddenly seemed larger, more complex, and infinitely more fragile. In that moment, watching the stranger grapple with forces beyond her control, Barron made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. He slipped away quietly, his mind racing with possibilities. The young heir had resources at his fingertips that Mrs. Simmons could only dream of. But more than that, he had a growing sense of responsibility. As he walked back to Trump Tower, each step felt different, as if he were navigating new territory. The polished surfaces of Trump Tower seemed to mock Barron as he strode through the lobby, his mind a whirlwind of determination and doubt. He was about to attempt something no one in his family had ever done before: save a stranger's home without using his name or fortune as a battering ram. But in a world where money talked and compassion whispered, how could he possibly succeed? Barron's fingers flew across the keyboard of his state-of-the-art laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his furrowed brow. He found himself immersed in a world far removed from his usual concerns of advanced calculus and geopolitics. Terms like foreclosure, liens, and refinancing danced across the screen, each one a piece of a puzzle he was desperately trying to solve. As dawn broke over the city, Barron rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his phone. He had a list of financial advisors to contact, but he knew he had to tread carefully. "Good morning, this is Barron Smith," he said, wincing at his clumsy attempt at anonymity. The advisor on the other end launched into a series of questions that left Barron's head spinning. Days turned into weeks, and Barron's resolve was tested time and again. He learned about the intricacies of property taxes, the pitfalls of predatory lending, and the cold, hard math of interest rates. Each potential solution seemed to lead to another dead end. The complexity of Mrs. Simmons' situation became clearer with each passing day. It was like trying to untangle a massive knot of financial threads, each one connected to another in ways he couldn't have imagined. Barron found himself wondering how anyone without his resources could possibly hope to keep their home in the face of such adversity. In moments of doubt, Barron would close his eyes and picture Mrs. Simmons's face, lined with years of laughter and worry. He thought of the home she had lived in for 4 decades, the walls that held her memories, the door frame marked with her child's growth. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This was a life hanging in the balance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of research and sleepless nights, Barron formulated a plan. It was risky, complex, and would require perfect timing. But it just might work. With trembling fingers, He dialed the number of the bank holding Mrs. Simmons's mortgage. "Hello," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'd like to discuss the account of Eleanor Simmons." As he spoke, he felt a curious mix of excitement and trepidation coursing through his veins. This was it, the moment of truth. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Barron Trump emerged from Trump Tower, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a sleek black briefcase. The weight of its contents, a cashier's check for the full amount of Mrs. Simmons's mortgage, seemed to pull at his arm, a physical reminder of the magnitude of what he was about to do. As Barron approached the bank, doubt crept in like a cold wind. His heart raced, palms sweating as he pushed through the revolving door. Inside, the quiet efficiency of the bank felt suffocating. He took his place in line, acutely aware of how out of place he felt. A middle-aged woman in front of him turned, offering a kind smile. "First time here?" she asked, noticing his nervous fidgeting. Barron nodded, forcing a smile. "Is it that obvious?" "We all start somewhere," she reassured him before being called to a teller. When it was his turn, Barron faced Patricia, the teller. His voice wavered as he requested to pay off a mortgage account. As he slid the cashier's check across the counter, Patricia's eyes widened. "Sir, this is a substantial sum. Are you certain?" she asked, her tone a mix of concern and disbelief. Barron's throat tightened. Was he overstepping? Would Mrs. Simmons even want his help? The memory of her desperate voice steeled his resolve. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm sure." The minutes stretched like hours as Patricia processed the transaction. Barron's mind raced, imagining Mrs. Simmons's reaction. Would she cry? Would she finally sleep without fear of losing her home? As he signed the papers, his hand trembled slightly. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but so did a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one mortgage. It was about making a real difference in people's lives. Stepping out onto the street, the world seemed different. The sun felt warmer, the air fresher. For the first time in weeks, Barron felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He'd done it. He'd saved Mrs. Simmons' home. But as he merged into the flow of pedestrians, Barron knew his journey was far from over. This act had awakened something in him, a desire to do more, to address the wider issues of housing insecurity and economic hardship. The stories of other struggling families echoed in his mind, fueling a newfound determination to create lasting change. The whisper began as a gentle breeze, barely noticeable at first. But as it swept through Mrs. Simmons' neighborhood, it gained momentum, transforming into a gust of hope that rattled windows and lifted spirits. The news of her miraculous reprieve from eviction spread like wildfire, igniting conversations throughout the community. In a neighborhood accustomed to foreclosures and evictions, Mrs. Simmons's story stood out like a beacon. Neighbors who had resigned themselves to losing one of their oldest residents now buzzed with speculation and wonder. As the story circulated, it reached ears that might recognize the young benefactor. In halls of power and privilege, whispers began about a certain young man with a famous last name who had been asking unusual questions about mortgages and foreclosures. For Mrs. Simmons, life changed in ways both big and small. No longer did she lie awake worrying about where she would go. Instead, she found herself surrounded by a community eager to help. One morning, she opened her door to find teenagers ready to work in her yard. "We're here to help, Mrs. Simmons," said a girl with bright hair. "Maybe you could tell us some stories about the neighborhood while we work." As Mrs. Simmons shared tales of the street's history, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The spirit of generosity spread throughout the community. At the local center, residents gathered to discuss supporting struggling homeowners. They established a neighborhood assistance fund and created a skills-sharing program. 1 month later, they celebrated their first success story. Mrs. Jenkins, a 72-year-old widow, stood beaming in front of her freshly painted house. Volunteers had repaired her roof and fixed her porch steps. "I never thought I'd see this place looking so good again," she said, wiping away tears. As the ripples of change continued, Mrs. Simmons found herself at the center of renewed community spirit. "I feel like I have a purpose again," she confided to her friend Alice over tea. "People look at me and see hope. It's a big responsibility, but it's also a blessing." Little did she know, her words echoed the thoughts of a young man miles away who was just beginning to understand the true power of a single act of kindness. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Simmons' living room, casting delicate shadows on the worn carpet. In her favorite armchair, the one her late husband had lovingly reupholstered years ago, sat Eleanor Simmons. Her hands, weathered by time and hard work, trembled as they held an envelope that had arrived with the morning mail. As Eleanor carefully opened the envelope, her heart raced. The letter inside detailed how her entire mortgage debt had been paid off, erasing the looming threat of eviction. But it was the name of her benefactor that made her breath catch: Barron Trump, the president's son. Memories flooded back. The tall, lanky figure strolling past her house, pausing to admire her small garden, offering a shy smile when their eyes met. Eleanor's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Overwhelming gratitude battled with a touch of guilt as she thought of her struggling neighbors. How would they react to this news? Would they see it as a betrayal if she accepted help from a Trump? A new dilemma arose. Should she keep this information to herself? The revelation could have far-reaching consequences for both her and young Barron. She could already imagine the media frenzy and potential backlash that would fall upon them both. Yet, as Eleanor sat surrounded by the memories of a lifetime, she knew she couldn't let this act of kindness go unacknowledged. The young man deserved to know the impact of his generosity. With newfound resolve, she made her way to the small desk in the corner. Eleanor pulled out her best stationery and began to write. Her pen moved across the paper, pouring out her gratitude and amazement. She wrote of the weight lifted from her shoulders and the joy of knowing she could remain in her beloved home. But more than that, she wrote of the lesson she had learned: that kindness knows no boundaries, that compassion can come from unexpected places. As she finished the letter, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made her decision. She would reach out to Barron to express her heartfelt thanks and to let him know that his act of generosity had not gone unnoticed or unappreciated. With a trembling hand, Eleanor picked up her phone. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the keypad. This call would bridge two very different worlds: the world of wealth and power that Barron knew, and the modest, struggling community that Eleanor called home. But in that moment, those differences seemed to matter less than the connection they now shared. As Eleanor's trembling fingers dialed a number that would connect two vastly different worlds, another set of hands held a letter that would reshape a young man's future. In the opulent silence of his room, Barron Trump sat motionless, Mrs. Simmons's words of gratitude burning into his consciousness. The weight of the paper in his hands seemed to carry the hopes and dreams of an entire community he had only recently discovered. The experience had profoundly changed him, opening his eyes to a world beyond his privileged bubble. For the first time in his life, Barron felt a deep connection to something larger than himself. He found himself lying awake at night, his mind racing with questions about inequality and social injustice. The stark contrast between his life of luxury and the struggles of those like Mrs. Simmons gnawed at him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, Barron started researching other ways he could make a difference. He pored over reports on urban poverty, studied successful community revitalization projects, and even reached out anonymously to non-profit organizations for insights. His computer screen, once filled with virtual worlds, now displayed spreadsheets of community projects and fundraising goals. His interactions with his family changed subtly but significantly. At dinner conversations, he found himself bringing up issues of social responsibility, questioning long-held assumptions about wealth and privilege. "I think it's important we give back," he said softly, his eyes meeting his father's across the table. His mother's fork clattered against her plate. "Barron, honey, where is this coming from?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. Barron's transformation was like a caterpillar emerging from its cocoon. The young man who had once felt isolated in his tower now felt connected to the wider world in ways he never imagined possible. He found himself looking at the faces of passers-by on the street, wondering about their stories, their struggles, their dreams. The city he had known all his life suddenly seemed new and full of possibility. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his room, Barron looked out over the sprawling cityscape. Where once he had seen only buildings and streets, he now saw countless opportunities to help. Each twinkling light represented a life, a story, a potential for positive change. The vastness of the task ahead was daunting, but for the first time in his life, Barron Trump felt truly alive, filled with purpose and possibility. As the sun dipped below the Washington skyline, the ripples of Barron Trump's kindness spread. In Mrs. Simmons's neighborhood, neighbors shared stories of renewed hope. Miles away, Barron gazed at New York City's lights, each representing a life worthy of compassion. His journey from privilege to purpose had transformed his worldview. The story sparked nationwide conversations about unexpected kindness. Barron, aware of his influence, began planning future charitable endeavors. As he turned from the window, a question lingered. How many lives could change if everyone embraced the power of compassion? What unexpected acts of kindness might you be capable of? How could you create ripples of change in your community?